Hello, everybody. Welcome to AP World History with Mr. Ansharsky. Just to verify that it's me, I'm wearing my ID on my person. Haha. Anyway, this is going to be our third chapter into Unit 0. And again, Unit 0 is covering the classical era, stuff that's going on before the actual content of our class. Unit 0 is all about getting us prepared for the rest of the year in terms of how to take notes, in terms of daily assignment expectations, and what we do on a day-to-day basis. So this is the first part of a two-part lesson. This is going to cover the ancient Canaanites. We'll talk about Israel and Phoenicia, and then we will talk about Persia and ancient Greece. The bell work is on the screen right here. It's also in that bell work packet that I gave out at the start of the unit. Basically, briefly describe Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. So the lesson objective is twofold. So explain basic ideas of various systems of belief, that means religion in AP speak, and philosophy in the ancient Mediterranean, and then explain similarities and differences between systems of government in the ancient Mediterranean. So since this is one chapter, you only need to do one daily summary, even though there are two parts, two lessons associated with this chapter. But before we talk about the ancient Canaanites, before we talk about Israel and Phoenicia, and then finally finish on Persia, let's talk about a new age that in human history that's transitioning us away from these initial bronze agriculture-based societies to more complex urban societies. And that's going on during the Iron Age. And the Iron Age, of course, is a time period when iron is going to be heavily utilized by human civilizations, not just in the Middle East, not just in North Africa, not just in Asia, but in Europe as well. We are starting to see more sedentary civilizations emerge in Europe, something that we will discuss more in detail when we talk about Greece and Rome. So, as a result of increased access to iron, which is a lot better of a metal than bronze, we are going to see improvements to agriculture. We are seeing iron-tipped plows. We are seeing iron weapons for conquest and imperial expansion. So we are seeing an improvement to agriculture. And as a result, there's going to be a major population boom during the Iron Age. We are starting to see increased amounts of people in the Mediterranean Sea area, especially. And when there's more people, we start to see cities. And when we have cities, they need stuff to live. They need stuff for survival. They need luxury goods as well. So when we have more urbanized environments, we're starting to see even more trade develop. And trade is a massive idea in AP World. It basically is the major focus of our second unit. So trade is important because it not only is going to see material and wealth being transferred all over the world, but trade also allows for people to move and for ideas to move. So trade is very important when we think about the spread of ideas across human history. And this idea of spreading is known as diffusion. And you should definitely know what this word means by the end of this class. Diffusion is the spread of ideas. It's the spread of culture. It's the spread of religion. It's the spread of ideas that transmit across trade routes. So as we are seeing during this time of improved agriculture, of improved trade, we're going to start to see extremely urbanized societies, much bigger than the ones that we talked about in Babylon or Egypt, much bigger than the ones we talked about in the Indus River, probably the same size as the ones we talked about in China. So we are going to see right off the bat during the Iron Age, an easier transition from city-states to bigger territorial kingdoms. There are some exceptions, of course, but territorial kingdoms and overseas colonial expansion is going to occur during the Iron Age. Let's first look at ancient Israel. We're going to look at a period between 2000 BCE and 500 BCE. So Israel, if we think about it in a historic sense, if we think about kind of the Israelites, I should say, because this is not to be confused with the modern day country of Israel. The Israelites mostly are comprised of traditionally a group of nomadic herders. They are going to originate in Mesopotamia near the city of Ur. And from there, we are going to see a steady migration to what will become the modern day countries of Israel and Palestine. So we are going to see a movement of individuals going from Ur, which is around here in Mesopotamia, going down to the Jordan River Valley right here. So a lot of settlement in ancient Israel is going to take place between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And these initial kind of settlers that are going to settle down and develop agriculture along the Jordan River, they are going to form small independent kingdoms that are ruled over by judges. That's the title for these local chiefdoms, these local groups of people settling along the Jordan River. There's going to be conflict, of course, with the natives of this region. That's a little bit of a continuity in world history. There's conflict between these Israelite settlers and the local Philistines, who also roughly belong to the same ethnic group, the Semitic people. And with these conflicts with the Philistines, these bands of people ruled by the judges are going to unite together. These different tribal units, they're going to unite together and they're going to form a kingdom. And we are going to see the kingdom of Israel. And we see the figures that are somewhat historic, somewhat legendary in King David, in King Solomon. And we see in the map right here, this is a historic estimation of what this empire would have looked like, with its capital being in the city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is an example of one of these Iron Age cities. It's enormous. It's enormous. And on top of that, it's going to be extremely complex in its monument building and its social stratification, in its hierarchy. But a major aspect when we talk about Israel, ancient Israel, I should say, has to be a discussion on their religious ideas. So when you have a chance, watch this video if you're watching this outside of class, but it's going to narrate kind of the vision of how Judaism is going to come into being. Don't worry, I'll talk about it, but it's just John Green giving a little bit of a cooler explanation. All right, shut up, John Green. So the major religion, of course, and something that is a long-lasting tradition from this ancient Israel is going to be the religion of Judaism. And ancient Israel is significant because it's going to be one of the first civilizations to sustain, to continually have the religious idea of monotheism, of having only one God. And to give a little bit of a backstory to Judaism, we typically call it an Abrahamic religion, meaning that there is going to be this early prophet figure, a man by the name of Abraham. Abram was his original name. He settled in Ur back in Mesopotamia, and he is going to be the first in a line of prophets that exist in Judaism. He is going to receive what we call the covenant from the Jewish God. So we are going to see this promise by the Jewish God that the Israelites are the chosen people of a single deity, of a single Jewish God. So the covenant is going to create a distinct cultural and religious identity for the Israelites, one that has very clear kind of distinctions between us and them. We're the chosen people after all. And that's going to be important in a second when we talk about the decline of ancient Israel. And as a part of this kind of religious atmosphere of monotheism, we're going to see the building of temples, as we did in Mesopotamia, as we did in Egypt, as we did in China. And the temple is going to be a major facet of Jerusalem. It's a major building that's built to honor this single individual, this single God. But on top of that, we're going to have a codified system of beliefs through the Torah. through what we call Mosaic law, named after one of the more important prophets in Judaism, Moses. And this is an example of how the Code of Hammurabi influences legalistic developments in the future. So going back to what we talked about in our first chapter, the idea of a legal code is found in religion, in something like the Mosaic law under Judaism. And this of course, includes things like rest on holy days, on the Sabbath. It includes things like dietary restrictions, what is kosher essentially. So these ideas of religious practices being set into law, that's something we can attribute as a legacy to the Code of Hammurabi. But of course, Mosaic law is important beyond its significance in Judaism, in that it is going to influence other Abrahamic religions, which will draw from the same cultural and religious roots as Judaism. And these include things like Christianity, which we'll talk about later, and Islam, which we'll talk about in Unit 1. In terms of society, let's look at ancient Israel. Well, there is a class hierarchy. That's pretty much going to be a standard for a lot of these ancient civilizations. But we know that as a part of this class hierarchy, that there was a close relationship between the kings of ancient Israel and the high priests at the temple in Jerusalem. The king, of course, is not a god, but there is a close association between the religious authorities, the priests, and the secular or non-religious authority, the king. But we also know that there was a hierarchy based on property and wealth. We know that there are the haves, the people who have property, the wealthier individuals in society, and the have-nots. And mostly this is going to reflect an urban versus rural divide. Rural people mostly going to be poorer commoners, while urbanites, they're more merchants and craftsmen and artisans. And in this class-based hierarchy, there is going to be a religious significance. We are going to see religion being used as a justification for social reform. In the John Green video, he discusses that an aspect of the monotheistic Jewish God is that there is a responsibility by his followers to improve society. And there are going to be poorer individuals who are saying, hey, how did we get to this class-based system? We need to transform religion to reflect the needs of everyday people. And that's where we are going to see a rabbinical tradition in Judaism. Rabbis, they are learned people that interact daily with the individuals in ancient Israel. And this idea of social responsibility in religion, that's going to be a major reason why Christianity will emerge. And we'll talk about that with our fourth chapter. In terms of gender and family, unfortunately, we do see the idea of patriarchy return in ancient Israel. This is something that is a similarity, you could say, between a lot of different ancient societies and a continuity in world history. Much like in China, much like we talked about in ancient China, there is a focus on having a big family, on having generations live in the same house. And on top of that, there is this respect given to elders. And that's expressed most famously in the Ten Commandments, a part of that Mosaic law, honor thy father and mother. I believe that's the fifth one. So in addition to these generational homes, there is going to be an extreme hierarchy. Women are expected to remain chaste. They are expected to remain not sexually active with anyone other than their husbands. And of course, there is going to be a we are going to see a lot of systems of patriarchy that are going to be enforced and kind of reflected in Jewish law as well, in this early Mosaic law tradition. Of course, that's not to say modern Judaism is inherently patriarchal, but in this ancient interpretation of it, we do have clearly defined gender roles for what men and women are supposed to do. So women in ancient Israel didn't have a lot of social standing. But why is ancient Israel going to go away? Well, it's mostly because of foreign invaders. there's going to be a series of invaders that are going to destroy ancient Israel. There are going to be some invaders that help them out, but then there's going to be a final invasion. And let's talk about that. Well, the first invasion is the Babylonian Empire, or I should say the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And Babylon is going to invade. It's going to take over the kingdom of Israel. And we are going to see political instability as a result. Israel becomes two countries at one point. There's the kingdom of Judah, the lights went out, and there is the kingdom of Israel. So prior to the Babylonian invasion, let me clarify this a little bit. There were these political divisions that led to the separation of Israel, and that's perfect ground for Babylon to come in and invade. And this is going to lead to what we call the first Jewish diaspora, or diaspora. I don't know which it is, actually, come to think of it. But the Jewish diaspora is a major theme in Jewish history throughout world history. And the term diaspora is an important one because we'll talk about it throughout units, throughout the course. We are not going to just talk about it with Jews, but we'll also talk about it with different groups. So a diaspora is when people are kind of forced to live outside their homeland, their traditional region, and they kind of, in their new homes, remain kind of closely knit within their own community. So Jews that are kind of expelled from Jerusalem after the Babylonians invade, they're going to kind of stick together and form their own communities when they are displaced from their homeland. So there's not going to be a lot of assimilating between Jews and other groups of people. There is obviously social interactions, but there is this strength of culture in Jewish society. And as a result of these various invasions by the Babylonians, by the Greeks, we are going to see Jews spread out and create diasporic communities across the Mediterranean. This reflects the strength of trade relations and these urbanized societies. Eventually, there are some times when Jews can return to their homeland. We are going to see the Persians being pretty chill with religious freedom and religious tolerance. We get to see another temple being built. The first one was destroyed by the Babylonians. However, after the Persians, it comes the Romans. And the Romans are not going to be very religiously tolerant. They are going to destroy the second temple, and they are going to initiate a long period of the Jewish diaspora, the Roman Jewish diaspora, in which Jews are going to be exiled from Jerusalem and are sent all over the Roman Empire, which stretches across the Mediterranean Sea. And eventually these diasporic communities, these close-knit communities, they're going to spread all over Europe, especially as we will see in Unit 1 and 2, into Eastern Europe and into Spain as well. So let's turn our attention now to Phoenicia. And it's a little different from ancient Israel, but they have similar origins and they're located in similar places. Well, the Phoenicians belong to an ethnic group that is related to the Semitic ethnic group. And the ethnic group that is related to that is the Canaanites. And Cana essentially describes this region between the Mediterranean Sea and Mesopotamia over here. It includes countries like the modern day country of Syria, Israel, Palestine, etc. So we know that much like the Israelites, there were nomadic societies that decided to settle along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And from there, we are going to see different city-states emerge, city-states that share a similar culture. However, beyond a similar culture, there's no real political unity between these different Phoenician states. They all share Phoenician culture, but they're not a part of some bigger empire. It is a collection of these independent city-states that have a similar culture. And they're nothing alike, these city-states, other than their similar culture. There's a mix of different political systems. There's monarchies in some places. There's kind of democracy in other places, kind of legacy that will be transferred to the ancient Greeks. And we'll talk about that more in our next part of this presentation. The only thing that really unites Phoenicia is that they have a similar language, they have a similar culture, similar religion, but they also have an extremely similar focus on trade. And I'll talk about that more in our last Phoenician slide. In speaking about Phoenician civilization, they do have a shared culture that doesn't vary all that much between these independent political states. We know that ancient Phoenician religion is polytheistic, much like ancient Mesopotamia. We know that this is kind of something that a lot of these ancient Canaanite groups practice, that there are different gods involved in the polytheistic pantheon. Another thing we know that is similar about Phoenicia is that they have a similar language, and it's one of the first recorded alphabets in human history. It's the basis for other civilizations that we'll talk about. It's the basis for Greek, what they speak in Greece, and Latin, what is spoken in Rome. So the written alphabet that's different from cuneiform that the Phoenicians developed is the basis for a lot of European languages. So there's a major legacy of Phoenician. But we also know, that there is a unique kind of status for women in ancient Phoenicia. There is going to be a degree of patriarchy in ancient Phoenicia. Women are required to veil themselves. They're kind of expected to hold certain jobs, i.e. not having jobs outside the home. However, women are important in ancient Phoenician religion, and they're important in ancient Phoenician myths as well. We know that women are involved as temple priestesses. They might have been a kind of semi-prostitutes, but that might be a reflection on people who were critical of the polytheistic religion, i.e. ancient Israelites. But women are involved in religious ceremonies. We know that for sure. We know that there are female priests, but we also know that there are legendary female heroes in Phoenician lore. And one of those figures includes the possibly not real, possibly real figure of Dido. Dido is going to be the legendary founder of a major colony of ancient Phoenicia. And that colony is Carthage. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about Rome, and a little bit more when we talk about trade in ancient Phoenicia. And you can see a pictorial representation of Dido right there. So in terms of the economy, this is what we best remember the ancient Phoenicians for. It's the fact that they have such expansive mercantile or merchant-based trade throughout the Mediterranean Sea. A major focus of ancient Phoenicia is maritime or overseas trade. And we know that they have extensive trade networks across the Mediterranean Sea. We know that they're trading with ancient Greece. We know that they're trading, with the Egyptians. We know that they're trading with the Romans, and we'll get there later. And some of the things that they are trading include things like silver. They include lumber. This area of the Middle East, especially modern-day Lebanon, has a lot of cypress trees. But they're also going to be very notable for selling ships to other groups of people around the Mediterranean. Ancient Phoenician ships are legendary. People want them. That's why they're able to trade so readily with people across the Mediterranean Sea. But another thing Phoenicia is known for is dye. There is going to be a special type of dye known as Tyrian dye. It comes from the city of Tyre. And it's going to be demanded by groups across the Mediterranean Sea. This kind of rich purplish red color is going to be desired by different groups of people. It's a luxury good. And it's going to be a continuity, something that's continuously demanded by these groups of people in the Middle East. Everyone wants them. It's a symbol of royalty in ancient Rome, and it's going to be utilized even after the classical period. But as a part of the building of an expansive maritime trading system, the ancient Phoenicians are going to build colonies all over the Mediterranean Sea. And to quote the Bill Wirtz video, some of these colonies got so big that they started having other colonies. And that is going to be the example of Carthage. Carthage is this city in modern day Tunisia. It's going to be a major trading power that will be politically unified. They will have colonies that answer directly to Carthage. Because even though there are Phoenician colonies all over the place, these colonies are typically not going to be politically linked back home in ancient Phoenicia. They have a degree of independence, and as such, they're mostly just there to engage in trade. They are merchants who colonize these city-states across the Mediterranean Sea. So from Syria, from modern-day Syria, all the way to Spain, we have these very rich and deep economic connections. So you should be able to compare ancient Israel and Phoenicia. How are they similar? How are they different? Let's turn our attention to our last empire of this part of the video, Persia. So let's look at Persian geography, because even though they are going to develop right next to Mesopotamia right here, there's going to be a different form of political and social developments. And mostly ancient Persia, the Persian Empire, is going to be located on the Iranian plateau. It is an area of high elevation. It's pretty desertous, but it's also extremely rich in natural resources, especially precious metals like silver and gold and copper and iron. So there's a lot of natural resources available to the ancient Persians. And as such, they have the capital, the material to make a huge empire that will stretch all the way from India, as we'll see, all the way to Turkey. So it's an extremely big empire that the Persians will build, and it's because of this access to natural resources like iron and bronze. So even though it is mountainous and desert, and there is going to be a difficulty of settling this region, but it's going to be able to be settled thanks to advancements in agriculture, thanks to irrigation that is largely adapted from the Indus River Valley, but also from ancient Mesopotamia. But another thing that's frequent in ancient Persia is that frequently we are going to see invasions by Central Asian nomads. And the acronym CANS is just something my students came up with last year to talk about these Central Asian nomads. So there are going to be frequent raids in this kind of area up here of modern day Iran, what is modern day Turkmenistan. So that's kind of one threat that the Persian Empire will face, and something that future empires in this region will also face. So let's talk about how the Persian Empire came to be. Well, it mostly has to do with the figure of Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus is going to conquer the nearby kingdom of Media. He is going to unite Persia and Media into a new empire that is going to be extremely massive. It's one of the biggest empires up until this point in world history. It's an empire that stretches from modern day Iran all the way to modern day Turkey. But Cyrus the Great is not just called the Great for his massive imperial expansion, but also because when he expands, he is going to be religiously tolerant. He's going to say to the Jews, for example, who are in the Babylonian captivity, they're forced to be displaced from Israel, from Jerusalem, kind of trapped in Babylon. When Cyrus frees them, he's going to allow them to go back to Jerusalem. So the Jews are able to go back to Jerusalem. You can imagine how that makes people feel in the Persian Empire. They want to be a part of the Persian Empire because their religious traditions are respected. So as a typical theme in world history, we are going to see how in order to get people on board with an empire, we are going to see religious tolerance being granted to satisfy people, to make them happy so that they don't rebel against a conquering empire. Another figure that we associate with the expansion of the Persian Empire is Darius, depicted in the second image right here. Darius is also called the Great because he is going to expand Egypt even further. He's going to enter into modern day India. He is going to enter into Egypt. And much like Cyrus, we are going to see how Darius is trying to get people on board with his new empire. He's going to incorporate the ideas of the local people into local governments. So in the case of Egypt, Darius is going to say he's the pharaoh. He's adopting already existing, already familiar ideas of government and adapting them to his political system. So the pharaoh, Darius is going to call himself the pharaoh and integrate himself into the culture of Egypt. To make it so, he seems more legitimate. Eventually, the Persian Empire is going to decline thanks to outside invaders, and the biggest one is going to be Alexander the Great. The Greeks and the Persians hate each other. And we'll talk about that more in detail, but there will be future empires that will take the place of the Persian Empire. The Sassanid Empire. We're going to talk about the Parthians at one point. And after all these pre-Islamic civilizations, eventually we will see an Islamic empire that will take the place of this old ancient Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire, as you can see right here, is huge. It's stretched into Europe at its height, all the way in modern day places like Bulgaria, all the way to Sudan down here, all the way to India. It's a massive empire. And one of the biggest. And as I was saying before, how do they incorporate these different groups of people? They respect their religions, they respect their local customs, and take on their local forms of government. And speaking of which, we are going to see a highly centralized system of government, one in which the Shah has a lot of power. However, the Shah is going to delegate power to local governors who are only answerable to the Shah. And these governors are called satraps. And the satraps basically have rule over a certain province. Oftentimes, these provinces are going to just use the government that was there before the Persians got there. So if we use Babylon, the Babylonian Empire's example, the province of Babylon is going to be governed the same exact way as it was when it was an independent country. The satrap is simply the guy in charge, and all of the same forms of bureaucracy, all the same forms of government upkeep are kept the same. It's just a new group of people in charge, the Persians. And the satraps are expected to do a few things. They're expected to send troops to the Shah, and they're expected to collect taxes for the Shah. And the Shah, of course, is the Persian idea of an emperor. We know that the Persians are going to unite their big empire and make administration a lot easier through the building of infrastructure. They build something known as the Royal Road, and it connects the different parts of the empire, all the way from the Indus River, all the way back in Europe. A single unified road that allows for easier military access, but it also allows for trade. Trade flourishes on this Royal Road. Another form of political organization is the creation of a royal court. And a royal court essentially is the entourage, or all the people that hang on to and are friends with the king. The king has these elaborate ceremonies that everyone wants to be a part of. So we see how life is revolving, how culture is revolving around the central figure of government, the Shah. So the royal court is a form of political organization to centralize ancient Persia. But we also have a bureaucracy, much like we saw in ancient Egypt, much like we saw in China. This is something that is going to be emblematic, I should say, of highly centralized states throughout human history. So there is a highly centralized bureaucracy. There is a government structure in which taxes are collected efficiently. There's a system in which mail is delivered efficiently. So bureaucracy, if you ever see that word, associate it with the idea of efficiency. It's making government work so that a ruler can have his ideas expressed as public policy. And as with other civilizations, the center of an empire is its capital. This is where all government is located. And that government is the city of Susa, which, if we go back just a second, is right there, roughly in modern day Iraq/Iran. We know that there was a class structure in ancient Persia, one that mostly revolves around three sections. On top, we have the warriors, we have the king, we have the nobility, who are the commanders in the Persian military. Below them are the temple priests, the magi, and below them, everyone else. There's not a lot of evidence of slavery in ancient Persia, so we really have this class structure based on these three groups of people. These three, you could almost say, estates, and you'll get why that's funny when we talk about the Middle Ages in Europe. Sorry, I'm hungry. That is a part of this royal court structure. We are going to see opportunities for women to have a say in politics. Women mostly are going to be relegated to these patriarchal ideas of not having a public life. However, there are opportunities for women to have a say in government. The Shah has a group of women that that are his wives, known as the harem. And the harem is this big body that's filled with women that are all, well, and I don't know how to say it, but they essentially are the long-term sexual partner of the Shah. So this is done so that the Shah has multiple opportunities to have sons to succeed him. But the harem is a place where women have a say in politics. They have access to the king, to the Shah. They can advise him on certain things. They can kind of say, hey, the son you had with me, he should be in charge so that I can influence him once he becomes Shah. So women do have a chance at political participation in the Persian Empire. That is something that is unique to them. And something, as we will see, is going to be a continuity with other Middle Eastern empires, with the Ottomans, for example, and we'll talk about them later. In terms of culture and society, Persepolis is a major city in the Persian Empire, and while Susa might be the government center, Persepolis is the center of culture. We have a lot of examples of public festivities in ancient Persia. We have massive public ceremonies for every major occasion. There's one for the New Year's. It's very important in Persian society. There's elaborate ceremonies for public funerals and such like that. So we have these public ceremonies that are an example of how we are creating a culture for an empire. We are trying to create a unified culture for a group of people who otherwise don't identify themselves as Persian. And another way we are seeing culture expand and diffuse throughout the Middle East is through the adoption of Persian as the language of high culture. And high culture essentially refers to what the literate people are writing and what they are depicting in art. So this is art intended for elites. And that is going to be where a lot of Persian as a language comes in. It's different from today. It's kind of an adoption of cuneiform, but it's going to be the language of poetry. It's the language of literature. And this is something actually that is going to continue when we start talking about AP content. Persian is a major cultural influence on Islamic civilizations that will come after the Persian Empire, roughly around 600 CE. So Persian is regarded as the language of high culture and the model for a good empire, even as far into the era of Islamic empires. And the last of which is going to end in 1922 with the Ottoman Empire. But another major legacy of the Persian Empire, and I'm like looking at these fries right now, I really want to eat them. Sorry, it's like 7. Anyway, so another major legacy of the Persian Empire is going to be the religion of Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is a religion that's still practiced today. Sometimes people dismissively call it fire worshippers. But Zoroastrianism is important for a few reasons that I'll talk about in a second. But what is Zoroastrianism? Well, essentially, it is going to be a religion that follows the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster. He's going to comprise his religious ideas, his relations with divinity in a book known as the Gathas. And the Gathas is going to detail a lot of religious practices. It's very similar to how Mosaic law is detailing Jewish practices. But what are some beliefs of Zoroastrianism? Well, a major component is the idea of dualism, that there are basically kind of two big gods. There's the good god, Ahura Mazda, and then there's the bad god, the god that's, is the counter, the foil to the good god. And that bad god is Ahriman. So there's kind of this constant struggle between these two gods. And this is kind of allowing for explanations of the natural world. It's similar to a degree that idea of harmony, of the yin and yang in ancient Chinese religion. But why is Zoroastrianism important? Well, it's going to be important because of how it influences other religions. But it also has a significance in how it's used politically. The Shah is not a religious figure, but he's heavily involved in state religion. So state religion essentially is, what is the religion, the official religion of an empire? So the Shah has an important place in these ancient Zoroastrian rituals. But it's also an attempt to make a religion that could be, adopted by all these different ethnic groups across the Persian Empire. It's a way to unite people based on a similar religion. But another way that Zoroastrianism is important is its influence on Abrahamic religions. And that includes a few kind of legacies borrowed from Zoroastrianism. And that includes the idea of monotheism. I know I said that there are technically two gods, but when you think about it, the idea of having a good god being the central focus, that's going to be taken from Zoroastrianism and applied to religions like Judaism, like Christianity, like Islam. But there are other ideas that will be expressed in these Abrahamic religions, namely Christianity and Islam. Say hello to this guy. And that includes the concept of the afterlife, that there is a place for good people, the heavens, and there is a place for, well, not so good people in HE double hockey stick. No, hell. And there's also the concept of the judgment day, that there is going to be a time when all the good people go to heaven, all the bad people go to hell. But we also have the idea of prophets being very important in Zoroastrianism. That's something that's definitely found in these Abrahamic religions. The idea of the Messiah, that there's going to be the second coming of an important religious figure, is very much going to be expressed, especially in Christianity. And we'll talk about that more in our fourth chapter. So you should be able to identify how is the Persian Empire similar or different to earlier Mesopotamian religions. So that's all I have for today. Thank you folks for listening. And we will pick up with the rest of chapter 3 in our part 2. That's going to talk about Greece. All right, go Greece light. It's funny because at the time of this recording, the actress who played Sandy in Grease, the musical, passed away, which is sad, but it's topical. I'm shooting myself in the foot. All right, I better stop before someone